The heat over Red Mesa Draw warped the air like glass when Calder Van heard the sound half-horse cry, half-human breath torn by fear. He followed it to the east fence, and there she was, a young Apache woman tied to a post, wrists swollen, head bowed under the punishing sun, a wounded bay mare trembling beside her. Calder cut the rope in one stroke. She collapsed, but forced her eyes open when his shadow fell across her. A tall man, broad-shouldered, dust and sun carved into his skin, another stranger, another danger. Her lips parted in a brittle whisper, the voice of someone who had stopped hoping for mercy. "Do whatever you want, Cowboy." Calder froze. He didn't touch her again, not roughly, not cruelly. "I'm here to help you," he said quietly. And with careful hands he lifted her, as if afraid the desert had already taken too much from her. Before we continue, please take a moment to support the channel. A simple like, a quick comment, or hitting that subscribe button helps these Wild West tales reach more people who love them. Let me know where you're listening from, and thank you for riding along with us. Red Mesa Draw stretched wide and unforgiving beneath the late-day sun. The land wore its colors in harsh layers: iron-red soil, sun-bleached grass, and mesas rising like ancient bones against the empty sky. Wind carved through the ravines with a dry whistle, carrying dust that clung to every nail and windowsill of Van Homestead. Calder's ranch sat alone at the foot of a sandstone ridge, a stubborn square of weathered boards and creaking fences caught between heat and silence. Life here didn't move fast. It endured. Inside the modest cabin, the air smelled faintly of smoke, iron, and the sagebrush Calder burned each morning to keep the insects at bay. He laid the Apache girl on the narrow bed near the window, where late light fell across her face in thin amber lines. She was barely conscious, but her features were sharp cheekbones dusted with sun, lips cracked from thirst. A strand of black hair stuck to her temple with dried sweat, even in weakness. Her eyes held a quiet fire, the kind that belonged to people who had survived too much at too young an age. This was someone used to watching the world before trusting it. Her name came later, but Calder already sensed she wasn't made of fear. The swollen rope marks on her wrists told a story of pride punished, not helplessness. Outside, the bay mare she had tried to protect stamped restlessly, her injury wrapped with a cloth Calder had torn from an old workshirt. Calder moved through the cabin with the economy of a man accustomed to solitude. Every gesture was deliberate, silent, pouring water into a tin cup, wringing out a cloth to cool her forehead, adjusting the window for airflow. He didn't speak not because he lacked words, but because speech had never saved him from anything worth remembering. He looked like a man chipped down by heat and hard work, broad shoulders under a worn cotton shirt, hands blackened by forged soot, jaw shadowed by days without shaving. A faint scar crossed the inside of his left wrist, a thin white reminder of something done to him long ago, something he never named. Folks in Copper Bend whispered about his past ex-soldier. Trouble with command. Wrong orders refused, but Calder never confirmed anything. The anvil, not talk, was where he left the pieces of his history. As the girl stirred, her breathing rough but steadying, Calder watched her with the wary patience of a man observing a wild creature, deciding whether to flee or fight. She winced when she moved her arms. The rope burns dark against her skin, and the tension in her jaw told him she hated showing pain in front of anyone. Outside, the land stretched all the way to Copper Bend, A small settlement of weather-beaten storefronts, shifting judgment, and tight-lipped glances toward anyone not wearing the right color of skin. Word traveled fast there, especially when it came to the Apache. Calder knew this. He also knew the men who had tied her Brock Tally. Vern Mathers and Cole Darren were loud when drunk and cruel when bored. He'd seen the way they handled horses. He could imagine how they treated people. The girl's eyelids fluttered open, shadowed by suspicion. Calder didn't move toward her. "You're safe here," he said, voice low, steady. She didn't answer, but her gaze traced the room, then returned to him, measuring, questioning, unconvinced yet no longer fully afraid. The wind hissed outside, dust tapping lightly against the window, as if the desert itself was waiting to see what these two solitary souls would do next. Evening crept into Red Mesa Draw with a slow wash of violet light, slipping between the boards of the cabin as the Apache girl stirred again. Calder heard her before he saw her fabric rustling. A soft, pained breath, the slight scrape of her heel against the floor. He stepped away from the forge, wiping his hands on a rag as he lingered in the doorway between workshop and living space. Nahona pushed herself upright, her fingers brushing the blanket as though confirming it was real. Her gaze swept the room in quiet calculation, landing finally on Calder. For a moment, neither spoke. The space between them felt charged, held taut by everything unspoken fear, uncertainty, and the faintest thread of recognition that neither belonged to the softer parts of the world. "Where am I?" she asked at last, her voice hoarse but sharpened by instinct. "Van Homestead," Calder answered. "A mile south of the ridge." Her eyes narrowed at the mention of place. She glanced toward the window, as if gauging escape routes, or perhaps just relearning the horizon. When she shifted her weight, pain flashed across her face, quick but unmistakable. Calder took one step forward. She immediately tensed, muscles tightening like a bow drawn too long. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said quietly. She didn't respond, but her jaw unclenched by the smallest fraction. He placed a tin cup of water on the table beside her, not too close, not in a way that blocked her movement. She watched the careful distance he kept, watched the way he set the cup down as though placing an offering before something sacred and wounded. "Drink," Calder said. Her fingers wrapped around the cup, but she hesitated before lifting it. Suspicion flickered across her face, not toward the water, but toward him, toward the softness in his tone she didn't yet trust. When she drank, it was slow, deliberate, eyes never leaving his. "You cut the ropes," she said eventually. It wasn't gratitude, it was an accusation wrapped in confusion. Calder's voice stayed steady. "No one deserves to be left like that." The words hovered, fragile as desert glass. Nahona's expression didn't change, but something in her posture softened not much, only enough for a weary breath to escape her lips. She set the cup down with a quiet clink. "You know the men who did it," she said. It wasn't a question. Calder nodded once. "I've seen their kind before." Silence stretched again. The cabin felt smaller, the air thicker, but neither broke eye contact. Calder could sense a history in her guarded stare, the kind forged by years of being watched, hunted, dismissed. And she, in turn, seemed to read something in him, some private damage that kept his shoulders tense even at rest. Some pain tucked beneath the scar on his wrist. She looked at that scar now, gaze narrowing. "Soldier once," he replied, "and now I fix things." Her eyes lingered on him a beat longer. as though weighing the truth behind his words. Then she shifted, testing her legs beneath her. Her body trembled, but she pushed herself to standing anyway, refusing to show weakness before him. Calder moved instinctively, hand out slightly as if to steady her. She flinched back, not violently, but with the precision of someone who had learned the hard way not to trust outstretched hands. "I can stand," she said. He let his hand fall. "Didn't say you couldn't." Something flickered between them, almost a spark, almost the hint of what trust might one day look like. Outside, the wind slid across the mesa, brushing dust against the cabin walls. Inside, two strangers stood within arm's reach yet miles apart, bound only by circumstance in the fragile possibility that neither of them was as alone as they thought. Morning arrived in Red Mesa Draw, with a pale gold light creeping slowly across the sandstone ridge. Nahona woke to its warmth against her face, the scent of dust and coffee drifting through the open doorway. Calder was already outside, the steady rhythm of his hammer striking metal rolling through the stillness. It was a sound that belonged to him the way wind belonged to the mesa, enduring, patient, unyielding. She sat up carefully. Her wrists throbbed, but the swelling had eased. Someone had spread a thin layer of salve over the burns. She knew the scent, sage mixed with pine resin. The gesture surprised her. Men who cut ropes didn't always mend what the ropes had done. When she stepped outside, the sun was still low and gentle. Calder didn't turn at the sound of her footsteps, but his blows slowed, his attention shifting without fully leaving his work. She moved toward the corral where the injured mare stood, head lowered, flanks still trembling but no longer wild with fear. Nahona approached her with the assurance of someone who had spent her life reading the language of animals. The mare lifted her head when Nahona touched her muzzle. "Easy, girl," she murmured, fingers brushing the tender bruises around the rope burns. Calder finally set his hammer down. "You handle her well," he said. "She remembers who hurt her," Nahona replied, voice soft but edged with meaning. "But she also remembers who didn't." Calder met her eyes then, really met them, and the quiet acknowledgement passing between them was more than apology or gratitude, it was recognition. During the next days, they fell into a rhythm neither of them spoke aloud. Nahona helped gather water from the half-buried barrel, moving slowly but with determination. She repaired the torn saddlebag and ground herbs for salve, her motions fluid and practiced. Calder cooked when she couldn't stand long, his hands awkward but earnest. And in the evenings he repaired the cracked trough while she hummed an Apache tune that drifted through the yard like a memory carried on wind. They rarely talked, but the silence between them changed. It softened. It learned their shapes. One afternoon, a storm gathered far across the mesa, dark clouds dragging shadows over the redstone. Calder worked on a fence post while Nahona tied bundles of dried sage. Wind caught her braid and whipped a strand across her face. Calder watched her from the corner of his eye, not meaning to, but unable not to. Her movements were purposeful, although there was a sadness tucked deep behind them, something that hadn't yet found words. "You don't have to work," he said. Nahona didn't look up. "I don't know how to sit still." Calder considered that. "Me neither." She glanced at him then, the briefest flicker of a smile touching her mouth before fading like lightning behind a cloud. They continued working side by side, the wind snapping at loose pieces of twine, the smell of approaching rain filling the air. Later that evening, the first drops fell, scattering across the dry earth like offerings. Nahona stepped outside, tilting her face to the sky. Rain was rare in Red Mesa, and it carried the scent of everything the land had lost and everything it still hoped to become. Calder watched her from the doorway, her silhouette framed by silver streaks falling through the last light. "You said you fix things," she said suddenly, not turning. "I try," Calder replied. She was quiet for a long moment. "Some things break and stay broken." Calder stepped down from the porch, the rain touching his shoulders as he approached her. "Some things," he said, "find their way back." Nahona exhaled softly, her eyes closing for a heartbeat. When she opened them again, the storm had already passed, leaving only the faint drumming of leftover drops on the cabin roof. Over the next days, the bond between them only deepened. Calder brewed coffee the way he noticed she liked, less bitter, more water. Nahona began leaving a small bowl of herbs on his workbench each morning, something for the pain in his wrist. Though she never asked him how he got the scar, they learned each other in pieces. A shared glance, a softened breath, the way their hands brushed when passing tools, the way neither stepped away afterward. One night, Calder returned from checking the fence line to find Nahona asleep by the fire, a blanket falling from her shoulder. He lifted it gently, draping it back around her, careful not to wake her. But her eyes opened anyway, soft and unguarded, for the first time. She didn't flinch from the nearness of him. "You don't have to look after me," she whispered. Calder's voice came low, steady. "I know." There was no declaration, no promise, just two hearts learning the quiet gravity that pulled them closer each night. The land around them shifted too, subtly acknowledging their growing connection. Even the wind seemed to change, brushing the mesa with a gentler hand, as if it sensed that something tender was beginning to take root where only dust had lived before. The peace holding over Van Homestead was a thin, precious thing, stretched carefully between two people learning how to breathe in the same quiet. But peace rarely survived long in Red Mesa Draw, not when men like Brock Talley carried their pride like a weapon. The morning the balance broke, the air itself felt wrong, too still, too expectant. Nahona sensed it before Calder did. She paused mid-step beside the corral, eyes narrowing toward the ridge, where dust began to rise in three sharp plumes. Calder emerged from the barn, wiping sweat from his brow. One glance was enough. "They're coming." Brock Talley rode at the front, swaggering in his saddle, red-faced and mean, with the kind of anger men invent to cover their shame. Vern Mathers followed, his jaw twisted in a half-drunk scowl, and Cole Darren brought up the rear, knuckles white around his reins. They stopped just outside the gate, dust swirling around their boots as they dismounted. "Well now," Brock drawled, loud enough for the world to hear. "Looks like our little Apache friend settled in nice." His eyes slid toward Nahona with a smile that made Calder's blood run cold. "We didn't finish our talk last time." Nahona stood still, every line of her body taut, but she didn't step back. Calder saw the flicker in her eyes, fear. Yes, but also dignity, a fire still unbroken. Calder pushed the gate open with deliberate calm and stepped into their path. "You boys should turn around." Vern spat into the dust. "She attacked us," he lied. "We're just taking her back to town." "She tried to stop you from killing a horse," Calder replied, "and you tied her to a post for it." Cole shifted uneasily, guilt haunting his posture. But Brock elbowed him sharply and stepped forward. "She's Apache. That's all the law we need." Calder's jaw tightened. "Not on my land." Brock laughed. A short, ugly sound. "You think you can stand between us and what's owed?" Calder didn't answer. He didn't need to. The way he planted his feet, the set of his shoulders, the cold steadiness in his eyes, all of it spoke for him. Vern laid a hand on his holster. Cole reached for his rope. Nahona stood behind Calder, her breathing quick but her spine straight. Calder didn't turn toward her, but he felt her presence like a promise. "Move aside," Brock said, voice thick with alcohol and arrogance. "You don't want us to teach you the same lesson we taught her." Calder stepped closer, inches from Brock's face. "Try," for a heartbeat. The desert held its breath, wind stilled. Dust hung frozen. Even the sun seemed to glare harder, as if waiting for blood. Brock shifted, the first hint of uncertainty crossing his expression. He'd come expecting a frightened girl and a man too broken to fight. Instead, he'd found a wall he couldn't push over. Vern's hand dropped quietly from his holster. Cole looked away. Brock huffed a bitter laugh to hide his retreat. "We'll be back," he snarled. "Copper Bend doesn't take kindly to your kind mixin' with ours." Calder didn't flinch. "Then Copper Bend can choke on its own dust." The insult hit Brock like a slap. He swung into his saddle with a vicious jerk, and the three rode off in a storm of red dirt, their threats trailing behind them like smoke. When the sound of hoofbeats faded, Calder exhaled slowly. Nahona stepped toward him, her voice a whisper barely audible over her quickening breath. "They'll try again. I know." Calder finally turned to face her. The wind tugged at her hair, casting strands across her cheek. Her eyes were bright with something more than fear, something like the dawning realization that she wasn't alone anymore. Not truly. "You didn't have to stand in front of me," she said. "Yes," Calder replied softly. "I did." For a long moment they simply stood there, framed by the aching red expanse of the mesa. Nahona studied him, searching for the reason behind his loyalty. Calder didn't offer one. He didn't tell her he couldn't stand the thought of anyone hurting her again. He didn't say he'd felt something shift inside him the moment she whispered that desperate surrender, "Do whatever you want." Cowboy and he realized the world had taught her to expect cruelty before mercy. He simply met her gaze, steady and unguarded. The wind picked up again, brushing the dust from the fence posts. Nahona reached up with gentle fingers and touched his wrist where the old scar lived. It was the first time she had initiated contact. "Some wounds," she murmured. "You don't hide as well as you think." Calder's breath tightened, not from pain, but from the quiet truth of her words. "Some wounds," he said, "look smaller from the outside." Her touch lingered for a heartbeat longer before she let her hand fall. "You shouldn't have to protect me. And you," Calder answered. "Shouldn't have to fear men like them." The storm inside both of them eased, replaced by something unexpectedly gentle. The sun dipped lower, stretching their shadows across the red earth, merging them into one long shape. And for the first time, Nahona allowed herself to believe there might be a place where she could stand without flinching. A place where a man's strength didn't mean danger, but safety. A place that felt, impossibly, like home. The days that followed moved with an uneasy stillness, the kind that settles over land and heart alike after danger brushes close but does not yet strike. Nahona felt it in the way the wind shifted, restless along the ridge. Calder sensed it in the way the horses paced at night, ears flicking toward Copper Bend, though no rider came. Both knew Brock Tally wasn't finished. Men like him rarely left an insult unpaid. Late one afternoon, as shadows stretched long across the yard, hoofbeats approached, not the heavy, swaggering rhythm of Brock's group. This was steadier, official. Calder stepped onto the porch just as Sheriff Amos Keene reined in his horse. The sheriff's face carried the tight, apologetic strain of a man forced into a task he didn't want to claim. "Van," Keene said, tipping his hat, "got business to discuss." Calder stayed where he was, posture calm but immovable. "Then say it," Keene exhaled. "There's trouble brewing in town. Folks are stirred up about your guest." His gaze flicked toward the cabin window where Nahona stood just inside, watching. Brock and his friends filed a complaint. "They say she assaulted them. The townsfolk want me to bring her in." Calder's jaw tightened. "She's not going anywhere with you." Keene raised both hands in a pacifying gesture. "Calder, I'm trying to keep things from getting worse. I need to bring her in for questioning, just to calm folks down." "No!" The word landed like a hammer strike. Keene glanced at the door again. "You're making this harder than it has to be." Calder stepped down from the porch, closing the distance between them. She was the one tied to a post. She was the one beaten. If Copper Bend has a problem with her staying alive on my land, then Copper Bend's problem is with me. The sheriff swallowed, conflicted. "I don't want blood spilled over this." "Then leave," Calder said. The silence was so deep that even the wind held still. Finally, Keene shifted in his saddle, defeated. "I'll say I didn't find her. That's all I can do." "You did enough," Calder replied. Keene cast one last look toward the cabin, then turned his horse and rode back toward Copper Bend, dust rising behind him like a fading threat. When Calder stepped inside, Nahona was waiting by the table, her expression unreadable. She had heard every word. "You stood against your own people," she said quietly. "They're not my people," Calder replied. For a long moment she watched him, her eyes dark, searching. Men don't risk themselves like that for someone they barely know. Calder pulled out a chair and sat, resting his elbows on his knees. "Maybe I know enough." Nahona moved closer, standing beside the table where the lamp cast a soft glow across her face. "Sheriff Keene will tell others. Word will spread." "I know. They will talk about you," she added. "Judge you." "They already did." His lips curved into the faintest half-smile. "This doesn't change much." But she shook her head slowly. "It changes something." He lifted his gaze to hers. "What does it change for you?" Nahona didn't answer at first. She walked to the window, fingers brushing the curtain's edge as she looked out across the empty land. "When I was tied to that post," she began, voice low and steady, "I thought the next man who came near me would be like them. I thought—" She swallowed. "That's why I said what I said. Do whatever you want, Cowboy." She turned toward him. "I had no reason to believe any man would choose mercy." Her confession struck Calder deeper than he expected, cutting through the defenses he'd stacked over years of war and regret. "You were wrong," he said. "I know," she whispered. She joined him at the table, sitting across from him, the lamplight catching the bruises along her wrists. Calder reached out slowly, not touching her, only offering his hand on the table between them, palm up. An invitation, not a claim. Nahona looked at it for a long moment. Then, with a breath that trembled at the start and steadied at the end, she placed her hand lightly atop his. It was the softest contact, but it carried the weight of everything they had endured. Her voice was barely audible. "I don't understand why you are like this." Calder held her gaze. "Maybe because I know what it feels like to be on the wrong side of a rope, for the first time." True shock crossed her face. She glanced at his wrist, where the pale scar curved like an old memory refusing to fade. "What happened to you?" He didn't look away. "Orders I wouldn't follow. A punishment meant to teach me obedience. All it taught me was who I never wanted to become. Nahona's breath caught, not in fear, but in recognition. 2 lives marked by cruelty. 2 people who had learned to mistrust everything except pain. "You fix things," she murmured, repeating his earlier words. "I try," he said. Her eyes softened. Maybe some things aren't meant to stay broken. Calder let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. The cabin felt warmer, the world quieter, as if Red Mesa Draw itself were settling around them in a protective circle. Outside, the moon rose over the sandstone ridge, bathing the homestead in silver light. Inside, 2 hands rested together on a scarred wooden table, and for the first time in years, neither of them felt entirely alone. Dawn came softly over Red Mesa Draw, brushing the ridge with a pale wash of rose and gold. The storm of days before had passed, leaving the land washed clean, the scent of damp earth rising in delicate spirals from the ground. Calder stepped outside first, boots sinking slightly into the softened dust. Behind him, Nahona followed, her braid dark against the morning light, her steps sure despite the bruises still healing along her wrists. They walked together toward the eastern fence line, the same stretch of posts and wire where Calder had found her bound and broken. Now, the fence stood half-mended, boards replaced and wire still needing tightening. Calder carried a hammer and a satchel of nails. Nahona carried only herself, and it was enough. When they reached the very post she had once been tied to, she paused. Her fingers hovered just above the grain of the wood, not touching, but remembering. The new plank Calder had installed was smooth, unscarred, a quiet defiance against everything done there before. "You rebuilt it," she said softly. Calder nodded. Figured it shouldn't look like what they tried to make it mean. Nahona studied the post, then the open land stretching beyond it. "It feels different now." "It should," he said. She watched him drive a nail into the fresh board, the sound of each strike echoing across the quiet mesa. With every hammer blow, something inside her loosened old fear, old silence, old ghosts that had followed her since that day at Copper Bend. For so long she had carried the belief that danger lived in every man's shadow. Now she saw a different shadow, a broader one, standing firmly beside her instead of against her. When he finished, Calder leaned the hammer against the fence and turned toward her. The sun was rising behind him, outlining his figure in warm, dusty gold. Nahona stepped closer until she could see the small flecks of iron dust still caught along his jaw. "This place," she said, "it is not gentle." "No," Calder agreed, "and neither am I." He gave a faint smile. "Good. A gentle place wouldn't know what to do with either of us." She felt the truth of that settle deep in her chest. Red Mesa was harsh, but so was survival. It was the kind of land where only the honest things lasted. Wind, stone, the stubborn beating of a heart that refused to quit. Nahona reached out, her hand brushing his forearm, then resting there with quiet certainty. "I don't know what happens next," she admitted. Calder covered her hand with his, steady and warm. "We figure it out, one day at a time." A breeze swept across the mesa, lifting dust and sage scent into the air. It curled around them like a blessing, soft but sure. Behind them, the cabin windows glowed faintly with the early light. Inside, a lantern still burned on the sill, the same lantern Calder had lit the first night she slept under his roof. A small flame refusing to die even when the wind pushed hard against it. Nahona looked toward it now. the flame flickering but steady. "That light," she murmured, "it doesn't scare easily." "Neither do you," Calder replied. Their hands stayed clasped, the wind quieted, and in the vastness of Red Mesa Draw, a place carved by sun, wind, and hardship, two figures stood at a newly rebuilt fence, their shadows long and touching, as if the land itself had decided they belonged together.